Hi, we're here today with Professor James Hodge, who is the Peter Hewitt Foundation Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and Director of for Public Health Law and Policy at Arizona State University. So thankful you could join us today.
Chris, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, let's get started with the questions. One of the really interesting projects that you work on is with respect to you being the director of the Western Regional Office of the Network for Public Health Law. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing with that organization?
Oh yeah, the network, funded substantially by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, has been at work for the last decade on literally anything in public health law and policy that we can assist in regards to requests we get from all levels of government, federal, state, tribal, local, and then a lot of private sector partners too. Chris, there's just no topic that we actually don't address through the network if it's got public health and the law as its centerpiece. But let me be real clear. The area that we get most of our inquiries from, and considerable deluge of inquiries on, obviously in the last several months, is emergency legal preparedness. We do so much work on that nationally, and COVID-19 has produced an unprecedented level of attention in regards to what and how we can work in real time through the network and through our specific responses. So it's just been an incredible series of requests, literally hundreds of requests to our Western Region office out west. We do almost all that legal preparedness work for the network, but all of my network colleagues have been working extremely hard to try to respond to the real-time issues that you see out there.
Well, I really appreciate it, and it has become a go-to source for me and to my students who I have also recommended it. How updated it is, and you continually have great, webcasts. So I highly recommend it to anybody who's listening as well. But
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Sure. And please pass along my thanks to the other folks you work with. You have written and spoken extensively about the lack of an affirmative and consistent standard of care, which you and others have termed the crisis standard of care. And this is something that we need to employ in emergencies. And you've written in the past about the necessity to employ it in natural disasters, mass casualties, and where we find ourselves today, emerging infectious diseases. Why does this present such a problem in public health emergencies?
Oh, Chris, such a great question. It's just at the epicenter of what we're doing nationally right now in real time. And why is it so problematic? These are the real life and death decisions that are happening in hotspots across the United States presently in regards to COVID-19, from New York to Seattle to Los Angeles to right here in Phoenix, and very soon, I'm sure too, if not already in various destinations in North Carolina. Why are these so sensitive and so difficult? We have got to switch from the way in which we actually practice medicine and public health in sort of routine events, always keeping the patient's best interest fully in mind and at the top of our list, to a very different way of delivering care, a care that's delivered based on the public health outcome, saving the most numbers of lives, as contrasted with what's in that patient's specific best interest. Well, Chris, to be quite honest, these are the most controversial types of topics that you can possibly imagine government and private sector having to do, and yet it's what we're engaged in presently across the United States in so many jurisdictions. So it's all been implicated by COVID-19. But how well we perform now as a healthcare system and as a public health enterprise makes a critical difference for saving lives.
How would you say the lack of a consistent crisis standard of care has already manifested itself in response to COVID-19?
Yeah, you're seeing considerable dissension across a lot of different states and localities as to what precise elements to actually use for the purposes of crisis standards of care. So, for example, you're seeing different plans come out in regards to COVID-19 from different jurisdictions that are putting prioritization on things that some jurisdictions would not prioritize and others place high on the list. And you've seen some states already issue plans that have gotten basically a lot of dissension and litigation related concerns over who they were attempting to prioritize. There were plans, for example, released that actually would have explicitly put persons with specific mental disabilities at the bottom of the list for the purposes of who would get that last ventilator. Those are so problematic and difficult to actually sort of assess across different jurisdictions. But let me try to nail this point home really precisely so you have a good idea of just how important this is. If you're living in a particular state and it has an urban area and a rural area. And you're trying to ascertain and figure out where you might have your best chance of survival in response to COVID-19. And yes, in some jurisdictions, people are having to make that choice right now. Where is my best chance of survival? What you would want is to have some sense that any hospital I show up in that jurisdiction presents for me the same basic schemata of how I may fit into their organized approach to treating the delusion patients. But it's not true. And when the public becomes conscientious often of how differing levels of care may depend a lot on the specific hospital they show up at, what type of crisis standard of care implementation and phase they're in at the present point, it becomes really, really problematic. And we're starting to see that arise in relation to the hotspot in New York City, obviously, and other jurisdictions too. So that uniformity facet of it, why states are involved in setting crisis standards, is a big part of it.
So on March 28th, the National Academies issued a rapid expert consultation for crisis standard of care implementation. What are some of the guiding principles, and you alluded to some of those in your prior answer, for the law and ethics of crisis standard of care?
Yeah, I was on that committee that issued that rapid consultation to ASPR's secretary, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. And it was based on 10 years of work. We weren't just guessing as to what might be good, solid principles to work towards and how to infuse law and ethics into solid crisis standard of care guidance. So I feel very confident that what we produced in real time was very reflective of what we'd learned over the last 10 years through the National Academies. But Chris, legal and ethical issues underlying successful implementation of crisis standard of care just cannot be discounted. If you do not create the appropriate legal environment for conducting what you have to do in real time in crisis standards, there will be significant issues that already have arisen, as I mentioned in some of our last responses. But these typical legal sort of, I guess I'll say the legal sort of landscape in which you want to see successful implementation depend on a lot of factors. I'll give you a couple, and we can drill down on any furthermore if you'd like as well. One factor is liability protection. Now, this is controversial. And even today, just earlier today, literally had good debates with some great colleagues about how far we go with liability protections. But law and policymakers are not playing around in relation to how far they are willing to go to make sure healthcare workers, entities, and most explicitly, volunteers that actually are putting themselves on the front lines have some protection from liability for the sort of claims grounded in mere negligence that might surface if you don't protect them from that type of liability through immunity or other protections. A lot of jurisdictions, if they don't feel like they have strong liability protections for their healthcare workforce, are putting them into place in real time. Governor's orders and other things of that nature clarifying that. Even Congress in the CARES Act that was just passed not long ago, President Trump signed recently, made it quite explicitly clear, volunteers responding in real time, immune from ordinary claims of negligence. Nothing's immunizing persons from acts of gross negligence, wanton misconduct, or anything along the lines of what we consider criminal. But it's a critical part of it and controversial too. 2 or 3 other key points. Hey, scope of practice. What and how might we expect a nurse who is skilled and capable to exceed what he or she normally might do in a real-time emergency? That's about changing scope of practice. Legally, you can pull that off in real time, thanks to the emergency declarations in all 50 states as we speak. But it's necessary that they get that assurance that what we're expecting of the nurse or other type of physician assistant or other people, down the chain in relation to how we provide care, that it may exceed what they normally do, but it's lawful. And we're going to allow for it during the course of the emergency. And one other key issue, licensure reciprocity. Here's how essential that is. Let's say that the most immediate resource you've got for the purpose of responding in real time is from the neighboring state. They are not impacted to the same degree that you may be in North Carolina. You need those resources and those personnel. They're willing to come over. You've got 1,000 nurses and doctors waiting to actually make that destination to Charlotte or other places. That's not lawful in a routine event. I mean, they can't just cross the border from Virginia or other places and start practicing in North Carolina. We're going to look past that in real-time emergencies. Most states implementing licensure reciprocity for the duration of the emergency event, allowing those doctors and nurses and other licensed healthcare personnel to step in real time and practice in North Carolina or any other state that law authorizes that without having to go through all the licensure red tape. Now, their license has to be in good standing and they have to be coming as part of an organized volunteer effort, not spontaneously. There's no support for spontaneous volunteers of these protections. However, those mechanisms create the legal landscape through which crisis standard of care is possible.
That's really interesting. I'd like to follow up on one more question about liability. And really, what about liability on decisions about allocation of resources? You've talked about liability with respect to negligence, and distinguish negligence from gross negligence, which I think was really important for the listeners. But what about allocation issues?
Yeah, let me tell you, one of the clearest and most difficult decisions that will be made in real time, it's being done in New York City every day right now, is just exactly how we're going to allocate resources on a patient-by-patient basis. That's what we're protecting from liability. But there's a bigger allocation question going on too. How do we allocate within larger states? New York State has a lot of needs and demands. How does Governor Cuomo make those allocation decisions? Who might be responsible for those, and where might there be liability if we just didn't have the right vents in the right place in New York State? Or take any other state, maybe even out west here like California, with enormous resources, but also enormous jurisdictional spread. So do they make the right choices in regards to allocating not just the scarce resource of vents or ventilators, as I'm referring, but every resource possible for ensuring that we can actually meet what we can in a real-time emergency? So we're talking about everything from just the allocation of pure resources like vents and protective equipment, but also personnel. If we do have 1,000 volunteers ready, where do we place them? That is a really critical decision, and it's part of how we actually get through and get over crisis standard of care implementation. Proper personnel in the right places at the right time, really critical choices being made, most of the time by government actors that enjoy that sort of level of sovereign immunity to those sorts of decisions. But Chris, I'm telling you, there may be an example, because we've seen it in prior emergency events, where certain allocations are made that you almost can't defend. Allocations made to specific areas of a state or jurisdiction to the exclusion of other areas that might have been more vulnerable, poor, minority populations, or otherwise. I'm saddened to think that we will have some of those decisions that may arise in the near future. And when we do, those are indefensible and could result in potential, at least constitutional violations.
So where do you see us going with respect to the crisis standard of care after this is all over, or at least after this current wave is over?
Yeah, you mean what's the future of how we do this? Well, it's a great point, and here's why. Listen, I'm not the epidemiologist. I listen and work with them closely, from CDC to our state here in Arizona, and listen very closely about what the impacts may be long term. What and how we're hearing from those folks now about this being the first of potential waves of COVID-19 is for real. And so we're learning right now in real time what's working with crisis standard of care implementation, because in the next wave, assuming that may occur at a point in time prior to when we have a developed and approved vaccination for widespread use across the US population, or global populations for that matter. Chris, when we have that second wave, everything that we're seeing working well and doing successfully in regards to COVID response efforts through crisis standard of care needs to be replicated, needs to be done even better, and needs to be working in real time to save as many lives as possible from the second wave, which could be as deleterious as what we've seen presently. And as a result, what you're going to see in real time that's very important to know is that we're not just doing crisis standard of care, we're studying crisis standards of care. We're hopefully seeing and creating that sort of situation where legally we've created the right impetus for doing it, and we've created a legal landscape that makes it possible. But what works and where and why, that's being studied also simultaneously, because we may have to replicate it again a lot sooner than you might think.
I have one additional question. You talk about the legal landscape. And so with respect to the crisis standard of care, since the states hold all the power in this, or most of the power in this area, not all, how do we create uniformity?
That's a great question. And part of it is what the feds have been looked to try to assist on. This is a very tough question. So creating uniformity across jurisdictions that are simultaneously experiencing different levels of COVID-19 infection. This is not the same pandemic in every state right now. We're all in states of emergency, That's the legal trigger for implementing crisis standard of care that every state would rely on, I dare say. But Chris, we're not experiencing in Phoenix what's being experienced in New York City, nor is probably being experienced in Winston-Salem or Charlotte or Raleigh. Consequently, in relation to that, how we create uniformity might be, and the feds have been asked to produce this, based on some sort of federal assessment of how we should allocate vents and other scarce resources to patients in hospital settings in real time. But that's not viable. I mean, we considered it in relation to some guidance issued to ASPR for the purposes of the National Academy's rapid consultation. We considered that, but the sheer option and the sheer reality is it's just not the same pandemic in every location simultaneously. You really would be making different decisions in different metropolitan areas depending on what you're actually experiencing. New York's decisions are different from LA's right now. But where you can defend it is, first of all, if you've proceeded legally, if you've proceeded ethically, and if you're relying on your crisis standard of care implementation on the very best known science of what we have available to us, as well as what we learn in real time works from a medical perspective, you can defend those crisis standard of care decisions. That is a changing target. That's going to change in the next 2 weeks. It'll be different than what we see now. We've always recognized that with crisis standard of care implementation, and this is no difference in regards to what you will see changing over the next 6 to 8 weeks ahead.
Well, Professor Hodge, thank you so much. I see that our time is nearly up, and what a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your participation in the symposium, and thank you for the really important and critical work that you're doing.
Chris, thank you on behalf of all of my colleagues here at Arizona State University. Greetings to everyone at Wake Forest. It's a delight to be able to join you, and thanks for having me. It's very appreciated.